Hi, I'm Martha Lawler. I'm the cataloger for the James Smith Noel collection at Louisiana State University in Shreveport. Mr. Noel was a local man who was born here and lived here most of his life, and he started accumulating books when he was a teenager and continued until he was in his 80s. So over his lifetime, he accumulated over 200,000 volumes. Now if you come this way, we'll show you the collection. Mr. Noel passed away in 1998, and his widow passed away a few years ago. They did not have any children, so this is his legacy. It is a working collection. It is not meant to be a museum. It is meant to be used. So we are in the process of sorting through and making it a little more user-friendly. This room is the exhibit room. It is actually the smaller of two rooms, so we call it the little room. Eventually, the books that are older and the ones with nice bindings, the pretty books, they will be in this room. There will be a lot of empty space. You'll see as we go down through the collection, there's a lot of empty space in this room, and that is because we are in the process of shifting everything around. Eventually, everything that we've moved to the big room will be moved back here as we catalog it. So as you come down this way, you can see that it's pretty much in order through here. Most of the collection was printed before the middle of the 1900s, so most of it is creeping up to 100 years and older. We have two books that go back to the 1400s. So far we've found maybe a couple dozen from the 1500s, a couple hundred from the 1600s, and close to 2,000 from the 1700s, and we are still finding more.
Where did Mr. Noel keep this collection?
Before it came here, it was in an abandoned train station in downtown Louisiana, downtown Shreveport, and that building has since been torn down. It was sold to the city of Shreveport for a railroad museum, and was considered it would be too costly to refurbish it. So they tore it down. It's now, or it used to be on the side of the Hilton Hotel where the little cafe is on the corner. And at one time somebody told me there was an oil well near those tracks. So it was not ideal environmental conditions to have it in the railroad station, but most of the books are in pretty good shape considering the conditions they were in. You can see there's a lot of empty space right there. That will eventually get filled back up as we get things cataloged. Okay, now this is one of the books that is probably one of our most interesting. This is a book of costumes that was printed in 1807, and it was owned by a former actor whom a lot of people may recognize. And we don't know for sure that he used this to design his costumes, but you will probably recognize some of the pictures in here. These are hand-colored plates, and when Rudolph Valentino owned this book, it was at that time 100 years old. So he's really trying to find a unique source. Okay, if you come this way. Okay, this is the little room, and we're about to go into the big room. And everything you see in both rooms was collected by one person. There is approximately over 200,000 volumes, and we take up 2/3 of this floor. Now it's arranged in basic categories, and as I catalog them, they're pretty much staying together, but things are getting a little more workable.
Was he collecting anything in particular, or he was just a big fan of books?
Well, he was basically just a big fan of books, but if he had a particular focus, it would be the 18th century and on into the 19th, and then really before the 18th. But basically his focus was the 18th century. He has a lot of books on history and literature, and it mostly focuses in that area. And a lot of our patrons are scholars who study that time period. So if we had a focus, that would be it. He's really kind of all over the place with his interests. He was a man who just loved to learn, and he set this up to promote the joy of learning in other people, and that's something we stress to our students when we bring them through on tours.
What is the reaction when they see it?
They love it. You know, we call that door on the side there the surprise door, because they just almost hit the floor when they come through. Just the idea that somebody accumulated this many books. And we also point out to them that a lot of these books, you can't get them in any other form, any other version. This is a format that has managed to survive for all these centuries, so there has to be something in it. Everybody wants to go electronic now, but as we all know, electronic formats get updated frequently. So trying to stress that there is a place in the world for old books and printed material. They sometimes they will come through on the tours, and I can see them do this. You know, they're afraid to touch. They want to pick them up and look at them, and they just get so fascinated with them. Now, this is our vault, and we have not just things that are unique and rare, but also things that have something unusual about them. Most of what's in here has been cataloged, so you will be able to find them on the library's catalog on the internet. So this is an interesting find we had. We've been here for several years, and I happened to be working in one area of the big room one day and saw these two volumes. This is one of them. You can see the binding is not all that special. This was a version of repair work that Mr. Noel had tried at one point and realized that it was probably not going to work. But when I opened it, I realized these are issues of a newspaper from 1783 through about 1786 in London, called Bingley's London Journal. And the only other copies I've been able to find in North America is one issue of this newspaper at Yale. So we have almost 5 years worth, almost a complete run, 5 years worth. There have been a few copies in Europe, but as far as we know, we have the only copies of these particular issues. And you can see they've been fairly well preserved. Well, this is interesting because America declared independence from Britain, of course, in 1776, but in the 1780s we were still fighting them. So there are reports of troop movements over here, and these reports refer to the enemy's troops, and the enemy is actually us. There are also details of bankruptcies, ships that have sailed, what cargo they had, ships that have returned, what cargo they had, stock prices, all kinds of daily information. And each issue was about 2 leaves long, and it was a weekly. Okay. One of the special things we have is this copy of Aesop's Fables, printed in Paris in 1549. And you can see it had 2 different owners, and each one has had their name removed, probably by a succeeding owner. The only 2 copies of this we've been able to find are at Yale and at Cambridge in England. And you can see that the text, it's parallel text in Greek and Latin. So it's a nice little book. Okay, another thing we have are books of ownership. Okay, this one, we've stopped pulling this out too often. If we have a gem in the collection, it is probably going to be this one. It's one of the books we're most proud of. It's in the original binding from 1699, and it was once owned by a very famous scientist. You can see he's written his name, I. Newton. And we're not pulling it out so much anymore because it is starting to flake away on the title page. There is a note on this side from someone who says this book was purchased in a bookseller's shop near the house where Newton died. So they're trying to verify that it is his.
And what's the book about?
It is about converting deists and Jews to Christianity. So a lot of people know that Newton had an interest in religion, and that's sort of the reason why he got interested in science, was trying to explain the world around us. Another book we have that was owned by someone famous, and this we found just on a shelf in the small room here, just on its own, and it was once owned by a former president. Now, we did photocopy this book plate and send it to the curator of the Roosevelt collection at Harvard and asked him to verify it, and he said yes, that's his. Of course, since the book was printed several years before Roosevelt was born, the curator there said it might have belonged to his father, who was also named Theodore Roosevelt, and this little Roman numeral 3 indicates that it might have belonged to his son, so who was also named Theodore Roosevelt. Either way, it does belong to the family. Now, one of the first things we ask ourselves is, does this sound like a book that Roosevelt would own? And it is a book about hunting and fishing. And it's called Sporting Scenes and Country Characters. And it's all about outdoor life. So, yes, he probably did own it at one time. One of the things that I find is most interesting is when people who used to own the material left their names or left notes in the books. You get fascinating stories about the people. We have one book on is there life after death, basically is the topic. And it was owned by a woman who lived here in town, and she had written frantic notes all through the book, just desperately hoping, and apparently from her notes she had lost a child, and she was hoping desperately that she would be able to see her child once again, and that her child was existing somewhere. So, and it was just heartbreaking reading her notes, and you get a little glimpse of what life was like. We looked her up in the city directories across the hall and archives, and apparently she was a widow. So apparently this was all she had of her family, and she had lost them. Another kind of amusing thing that I found in some of the books from the early 1800s, there was a child's drawing of a beautiful lady who had a sweet face, and the style of the dress was from the 1830s. And then when you flip to the back of the book, there was a mean-looking lady who had an ugly face and dark clothes, and you kind of got the idea who was the child's favorite and who wasn't. And you just wonder what the story was behind that. So to me, that is probably the most fascinating thing about working with older materials, is where have they been and who's used them and what they've done with them.